Welcome back, my fellow thrill seekers. Get comfortable, turn off the extra lights, and prepare to leave the familiar world behind for a little while, because tonight the darkness feels a little deeper, the silence a little more unsettling, and the world you thought you knew just a little less safe. So sit back, relax, and let's step into the shadows. Tonight, you'll hear two chilling ghost stories set inside a haunted hospital. You'll uncover the dark secrets hidden within the walls of a place where doctors fight to save lives every single day. But sometimes, not everyone ever truly leaves. So dim the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare to hear the kind of story that some people would do anything to forget. Now, let's begin. I want to preface this by saying I am not the kind of person who believes in ghosts, or at least I wasn't. I was raised in a pretty no-nonsense household in rural Ohio, the kind of place where if something went bump in the night, your dad grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat, not a Bible. Science was our religion, logic was our comfort, and for 32 years of my life, that worldview served me just fine. Then I took a job at Mercy General Hospital. This was back in 2019. Before everything went sideways with the world. I had just finished my nursing degree at Ohio State, passed my boards on the first try, which, if you've ever taken the NCLEX, you know is either a blessing or a curse depending on how you look at it. And I was eager to get started. Young, idealistic, ready to save lives. You know how it is when you're fresh out of school. You think you're going to change the world. Nobody warns you about the nights. Nobody warns you about the third floor. Mercy General was one of those hospitals that had been around forever. Not ancient by European standards, sure, but old enough to have that particular smell. That mix of industrial cleaner, old carpet, and something else underneath it all that you could never quite identify. The kind of smell that gets into your scrubs and follows you home. The building itself was a patchwork of different eras. The main entrance was all glass and steel, very modern, very reassuring. But the older wings, the ones that hadn't been renovated since the 70s, felt like a completely different building, like a different world, honestly. The third floor was one of those older wings. It was the oncology unit, cancer patients, long-term care, palliative cases. A lot of the patients up there had been in the hospital for weeks, sometimes months. Some of them were getting better. A lot of them weren't. It's the kind of floor that changes you, if you work it long enough. You learn real quick that death isn't like it is in the movies. It's quieter, more patient. It sits in the corner of a room and waits, and sometimes you can almost feel it when you walk past a doorway. I started on nights almost immediately. Staffing was tight. It always is, everywhere. That's just the reality of American healthcare. And the night shift needed bodies. I didn't mind. I've always been a bit of a night owl, and there was something appealing about the idea of the hospital at night. Quieter, fewer administrators walking around with clipboards. Just you and your patients, and the soft beeping of monitors. My first few weeks were completely uneventful. I learned the floor, learned my patients, learned which of the older nurses to listen to and which ones were just bitter and needed to vent. I made friends with a guy named Marcus who worked the desk on nights. Big guy, former army medic, had a laugh that you could probably hear from the parking garage. He became something of a mentor to me, even though he was technically just a unit secretary. Marcus knew everything about that hospital. Every patient, every quirk of the building, every piece of gossip, stretching back 15 years. It was Marcus who first mentioned room 317. We were about 3 weeks into my tenure there, sitting at the nurse's station around 2 in the morning, eating vending machine sandwiches that tasted approximately like cardboard with a thin veneer of turkey. The floor was quiet. Most of our patients were asleep, monitors humming their steady rhythms, the hallway lights dimmed to that particular shade of institutional twilight that I would come to associate with the worst hours of the night. "Hey," Marcus said, not looking up from his computer screen. "You been in 317 yet? I don't think that room's occupied right now," I said. "It's not," he said. "It's been empty for about 3 months." "Okay," I said, waiting for the point. He finally looked up. Marcus had these dark, serious eyes that didn't really match his usually jovial demeanor. When those eyes went serious, you paid attention. "Just, if you hear something coming from in there," he said carefully, "or if your patients in 315 or 319 start acting weird in the middle of the night, just know that it's a thing. It happens. It's not a big deal, as long as you don't make it a big deal." I stared at him. "What kind of thing?" He shrugged, looked back at his screen. "Ask Janet. She's been here since before I started. She can tell you the whole story." Janet Kowalski was the kind of nurse who had seen everything twice and wasn't impressed by any of it. She was in her late 50s, built like she'd been carved from solid practicality, with reading glasses perpetually perched on the end of her nose and a coffee mug that said, "I survived the night shift, and all I got was this mug and PTSD." She was not, in any way, the kind of person you would expect to tell you a ghost story, which is exactly why it hit me the way it did when she did. I caught her on her break the next evening, and I asked her about room 317. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought she was going to tell me to mind my own business. Then she set down her coffee mug and looked at me with those calm, clinical eyes. "How long have you been a nurse?" she asked. "About a month," I said. She nodded slowly. "Okay, I'm going to tell you this not to scare you, but because you need to know. Because you're going to be working this floor for a while, and it's better you hear it from me than piece it together yourself at 3 in the morning." She told me about a patient named Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor had been admitted to Mercy General in the fall of 2011. She was 67 years old, a retired school teacher from Columbus, and she had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. By all accounts, she was a remarkable woman, sharp as a tack, funny, the kind of patient who remembered every nurse's name and asked about their families and sent handwritten thank you notes when someone had a particularly hard night. The staff loved her. Everyone who worked that floor during those months said the same thing. Eleanor Marsh was one of those patients who makes you remember why you became a nurse in the first place. She was in room 317 for 4 months. And then, on a Thursday night in January, at approximately 3:15 in the morning, Eleanor Marsh passed away. Her daughter had been there. The night nurse, a woman named Patricia, who had since retired to Florida, had been with her. It was, by all accounts, a peaceful death, the kind you hope for when you work in oncology, the kind that looks like sleep. Patricia had done everything by the book, called the attending, called the family, started the paperwork. Standard procedure. She'd left the room briefly to get some forms from the nurse's station. When she came back, the television in room 317 was on. "Now, look. TVs turn on by themselves sometimes. Electronics are weird. That could have been anything. Patricia had turned it off, assumed it was some kind of power surge or malfunction, made a note to call maintenance, and gone back to her paperwork. She was a practical woman. She didn't jump to conclusions. But then about 20 minutes later, while she was at the nurse's station finishing her documentation, she heard something, a voice, coming from room 317. She described it later, and Janet had heard this directly from Patricia years before she retired, as sounding like someone reading aloud. Not loud, not frantic, just the calm, steady cadence of someone reading out loud to themselves, the way you might read a book, or a letter, or maybe a poem. Patricia had gone back to the room. The television was off again. The room was empty except for Eleanor, who was, of course, exactly as she had been left. But the reading voice had stopped the moment Patricia opened the door, and the room felt different somehow, charged like the air before a thunderstorm. Patricia had chalked it up to exhaustion and stress, finished her shift, and gone home. But it didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, multiple staff members reported similar experiences. The television turning on and off on its own. Voices, always soft, always calm, never threatening, heard through the closed door. One of the nurses, a young guy named Derek, swore he had walked past room 317 one night and seen the light on under the door, even though the room was unoccupied and the light switch was off when he checked. Another nurse reported smelling Eleanor's perfume, a specific scent, lavender and something else, something old-fashioned, in the hallway outside the room, particularly between 2 and 4 in the morning. The room had been occupied a few times since then. Other patients, other cases, but staff had noticed that patients in 317 tended to be more restless at night than patients in comparable rooms. Not frightened, not disturbed, just wakeful. And a few of them over the years had mentioned hearing a woman's voice, soft, friendly, like someone checking in on them. One patient, an 80-year-old man named Gerald, who had been admitted for complications following surgery, had told his day nurse very matter-of-factly that the nice lady who came in at night had been reading to him. He described her in detail. White hair, kind eyes, comfortable shoes. The description matched Eleanor Marsh. Administration naturally had chosen to interpret all of this as the confused ramblings of sick and medicated patients, combined with the overactive imaginations of sleep-deprived nursing staff. The room had been kept empty for the past few months, not because of any official acknowledgement of the situation, but because, and this was Janet's reading of it, even the administrators who dismissed the stories didn't particularly want to assign patients there if they had the option. So, Janet said, picking up her coffee mug again, that's the story of room 317. Nothing bad has ever happened. Nobody's been hurt. If anything, the patients who've spent time in there seem, she searched for the word, comforted. But it's unsettling, and you need to know about it so you don't freak out if you hear something. I nodded slowly. I wanted to say something rational and grounded, the way my father would have. Wanted to say there was obviously a logical explanation for all of it. But I didn't say anything, because something in Janet's steady, unsentimental tone told me that she had been nursing long enough to know the difference between coincidence and something else, and she clearly believed it was something else. I thought about it on my drive home that morning, watching the sun come up over the highway. I thought about it for the next several days, and then, gradually,
I forgot about it the way you forget about things when you're busy and tired and your feet hurt and you've got 12 patients to take care of.
Until the night of February 14th, Valentine's Day. I remember because the day shift nurses had put up little paper hearts at the nurses' station, and someone had brought in a box of those chalky conversation heart candies that nobody actually likes but everyone eats anyway. It had been a hard week. We'd lost 2 patients in 3 days, which is always rough, and the kind of emotional weight that accumulates in those situations was sitting on everyone's shoulders, like wet concrete. I was doing my 2 a.m. rounds. Everything was quiet, everyone was stable, and I was moving through the hallway on autopilot, the way you do after enough night shifts. I had my little pen light and my clipboard, and I was just going through the motions. Check on Mr. Patterson in 311. Check on Mrs. Okafor in 313. Check on... I stopped. The light was on in room 317, not a sliver under the door. The full, warm glow of an overhead light spilling out into the hallway. Room 317 was empty, had been empty for 3 months. I stood in the hallway and stared at that stripe of light on the floor and felt something shift inside me. Not fear, exactly, not yet. More like that feeling you get when something is wrong but you haven't processed what it is yet. That half second of cognitive dissonance before your brain catches up. I stood there for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Then I heard it. A voice. Soft, even, unhurried. Like someone reading aloud to themselves in the middle of the night because they couldn't sleep. The words were indistinct, too muffled by the door to make out, but the cadence was clear. A woman's voice. Older, warm. Every rational instinct I had said, someone is in that room. A patient who wandered in maybe. A visitor who somehow got onto the floor. A colleague taking a break somewhere unusual. There were 100 completely reasonable explanations. I reached out and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The overhead light was off. I was standing in the doorway with my hand on the door frame, and the room was dark and empty and smelled faintly, so faintly that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, of lavender. The voice had stopped the instant I pushed the door. I stood in that doorway for a long moment, my pen light casting a thin white beam across the empty bed, the blank television, the window with its view of the dark parking lot below. Everything was exactly as it should be in an unoccupied hospital room. I stepped back into the hallway and pulled the door closed. My hands were shaking. I noticed this with a kind of detached clinical interest, the way a nurse notices symptoms. Fine motor tremor, probably stress-induced, elevated heart rate, slight dryness in the mouth, classic acute stress response. I stood in the hallway and breathed for a moment. Then I walked back to the nurse's station. Marcus looked up from his computer, took one look at my face. 317? He said. 317, I confirmed. He nodded, reached under the desk, and produced a bag of potato chips. Eat something, he said. It helps. I sat down and ate potato chips at 2:30 in the morning and tried to figure out how to recalibrate my entire understanding of the world. Over the next several months, I had 2 more experiences with room 317. The second time, I heard the voice again. Same soft cadence, same indistinct words. And this time, I didn't open the door. I just stood in the hallway and listened for a while. There was nothing frightening about it. That was the strangest part. It was almost peaceful, like being read to sleep when you're a kid, like someone keeping watch. The third time was different.
It was a night in late summer, August or early September, and we had a patient in 317 for the first time in months. A woman in her late 70s named Rose, admitted for a respiratory infection, not expected to be with us long. She was going to be fine, just needed monitoring and IV antibiotics. I had checked on her at midnight and she was sleeping soundly. At 3 a.m., her call light came on. I went in. Rose was awake, sitting up slightly in her bed, looking completely calm and lucid. No distress, good color, vitals were fine when I checked. Everything okay? I asked. Do you need something? Oh, I'm fine, honey, she said in that sweet, matter-of-fact way that older patients sometimes have. I just wanted to let someone know that the lady who was visiting me left. I didn't want you to worry if you saw her leaving. I kept my voice very steady. What lady was that? Rose smiled. The one who was sitting with me, white hair. She was reading to me. Something lovely, I don't remember what. I fell asleep listening to her. She settled back against her pillow. She was just the nicest thing. I told her she didn't have to go, but she said her work here was done. I stood at Rose's bedside for a moment. Her work here was done, I repeated. That's what she said. Rose closed her eyes. I think I can sleep now. Thank you, dear. I turned off the call light and walked back to the nurse's station. Marcus was watching me. Rose in 317. I said. She had a visitor. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very softly, Eleanor always did love her patients. I have been a nurse for 5 years now. I have moved to a different hospital in a different city, and I have seen things in that time that have tested my understanding of the world in ways both terrible and profound. I have held the hands of people in their final moments, and I have watched others claw their way back from the edge, and I have learned that the line between this world and whatever comes next is thinner and stranger than any of us are willing to admit. I don't know what Eleanor Marsh is, or was, or continues to be. I don't know if what I experienced in that hallway was a ghost in the traditional sense, or some kind of residual energy, or something that our language doesn't even have a good word for yet. What I know is this: in room 317 of Mercy General Hospital, something keeps watch over the sick and the frightened in the small hours of the night. Something reads to them when they can't sleep. Something sits with them so they don't feel alone. And whatever that something is, I don't think it means any harm. I think it's just a school teacher from Columbus who loved her patients and couldn't quite bear to leave.
People always ask me why I left pediatric nursing. I give different answers depending on who's asking. To my family, I say I needed a change of pace. To colleagues, I say I wanted to try something different, expand my skill set. To my therapist, and yes, I have a therapist now, which is something I never thought I'd say. I tell the truth. The truth is that I left because of Hargrove Children's Hospital, because of what happened there during the winter of 2017, because of the children who told me things they couldn't possibly have known, and the things I saw in the East Corridor at night, and because of one little girl named Amara, who changed the way I understand the world in ways I am still, years later, trying to process. Let me back up. Hargrove Children's Hospital was a dedicated pediatric facility in the mid-Atlantic region. I'm going to keep the exact location vague, partly for privacy reasons, and partly because the hospital has since been absorbed into a larger health system, and I don't want anyone trying to investigate. It was a good hospital, Excellent care, dedicated staff, the kind of place that had murals on the walls and therapy dogs on Wednesdays and child life specialists who could turn a terrifying medical experience into something almost manageable for a sick kid and their family. I had been working there for about 2 years when things started to happen. I need to be clear about something up front. I was working the oncology and long-term care unit. Pediatric oncology is its own particular world, and if you've never worked it, it's genuinely hard to explain what it does to you over time. You are surrounded by sick children, some of whom are going to get better, and some of whom are not. You become extremely good at holding two simultaneous emotional realities, hope and grief, joy and sorrow, in the same space at the same time. You learn to celebrate small victories with an intensity that people outside healthcare find difficult to understand. You also learn to carry loss in a way that is sustainable, because if you don't, you will not last long. I had gotten pretty good at all of that. I had been doing it for 2 years. But there are some things you cannot really prepare for. Some things that fall outside the scope of even the best nursing education. The first thing I noticed was the children talking about Marcus. Marcus wasn't a patient. Marcus wasn't a staff member. I didn't know who Marcus was for the first several weeks that the children mentioned him, which made the whole thing deeply unsettling. It started with a 7-year-old boy named Caleb, who was being treated for leukemia and was doing reasonably well, responding to treatment, good spirits. The kind of kid who could make the whole unit laugh with his running commentary on everything. Caleb's mother was a constant presence, fierce and devoted, and the two of them had this rapport with the nursing staff that made their room feel almost like a community center sometimes. One morning I came in for my shift and Caleb's mom stopped me in the hallway. She looked like she hadn't slept. "Caleb was up last night," she said quietly. "He was talking to someone. I thought he was on the phone. You know how kids are with tablets. But his tablet was off and he was just talking. To the wall, basically. Or to something I couldn't see." I nodded. This wasn't completely unusual. Fever, medication, the strange liminal mental states that illness can induce. "What was he saying?" She shook her head slowly. He was asking questions, like he was talking to a friend. And then, at some point he said. She stopped, swallowed. "Okay, Marcus, I'll tell her." And then, he looked at me and went to sleep. "Tell you what?" I asked. "I don't know. He doesn't remember any of it. I filed it away, didn't think much of it." But then, 2 weeks later, a different patient mentioned Marcus. This was a 9-year-old girl named Lily, in for a bone marrow transplant. Sharp kid, voracious reader, the kind of patient who made you work for her trust. And then, once she decided she liked you, was completely and utterly loyal. Lily mentioned Marcus in the middle of what had been a completely normal conversation about which hospital jello flavor was the least offensive. "Marcus says the green one is the best," she said, with complete conversational casualness. I stopped. "Who's Marcus?" She shrugged. "The boy who comes at night sometimes. He's nice. He's got a red baseball cap." "Is he a patient?" I asked carefully. There was no patient named Marcus on our unit. "I don't think so," she said. "He doesn't have any tubes or anything. He just kinda shows up and talks to me when I can't sleep." She reached for her cup of jello, green as though making a point. "He said you were nice. He said to trust the nurses." I spent the rest of that shift in a state of controlled professional calm that was entirely at odds with the complete internal chaos I was experiencing. 2 patients, different rooms, different ages, both mentioning a boy named Marcus who appeared at night. I told myself there was a logical explanation. I told myself I was connecting dots that weren't actually connected. Then I asked Janet. There was a Janet on this unit too. I swear there's a Janet on every long-term care unit in America. They are the foundation upon which healthcare is built. I asked Janet if the name Marcus meant anything to her. Janet put down her pen very carefully. "Where did you hear that?" she asked. "Caleb and Lily both mentioned him," I said. "A boy named Marcus, red baseball cap, shows up at night." Janet was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Come with me." She took me to the break room and closed the door, which Janet never did, because Janet did not believe in closed doors and private conversations when she could just say whatever needed to be said in the open. The fact that she closed that door made my stomach drop. She told me about Marcus Webb. Marcus had been a patient at Hargrove Children's Hospital approximately 12 years earlier. He was 10 years old when he was admitted, diagnosed with a brain tumor. Aggressive, inoperable, the kind of diagnosis that lands like a bomb in the middle of a family and leaves nothing standing. He had been on the unit for almost 8 months, long enough that he knew every staff member by name. Long enough that he became one of those patients that the whole unit rallies around, the way you do sometimes with kids, the way their particular spirit and humor and courage gets into your bones. Marcus Webb had loved baseball, had worn his team cap every single day of his 8 months on that unit, even when he was feeling terrible, even in the operating room when they'd let him keep it as long as possible. The staff had eventually gotten a special arrangement with the surgical team to let him wear it right up until he went under anesthesia. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, 12 years ago, with his family around him and his baseball cap on the bedside table. He was 10 years old. He's been seen on this unit since about 6 months after he passed, Janet said in a tone so steady and matter-of-fact that it was somehow more chilling than if she had been whispering. Not by staff, mostly, by patients, specifically by children who are very ill, usually at night, usually when they're scared or can't sleep. He talks to them. He seems to... She paused, searching for the right word. Help them. Calm them down. Give them information sometimes. Information, I repeated. Things they shouldn't know. Things about their treatments, mostly. Things that turn out to be accurate. She met my eyes. We had a patient about 3 years ago, a 6-year-old, who told her mother that Marcus had said her next scan would be clear. 3 days later, her scan came back completely clear. First clear scan in 8 months. I sat with that for a long moment. "Does administration know?" I asked. Janet's expression could most charitably be described as deeply sardonic. "What do you think?" she said. Over the following weeks, I started paying more attention. I started asking patients, gently, carefully, in the way you ask kids things when you don't want to make them feel weird or scared about what they've experienced, whether they had any visitors at night, whether they'd met anyone. About a third of my long-term patients mentioned Marcus, usually unprompted once I created the opening. They described him consistently. A boy, maybe 10 or 11, wearing a red baseball cap, friendly, calm, showing up around 2 or 3 in the morning when the unit was quiet. Several of them mentioned that he seemed to know things about what was going to happen, whether a treatment was going to work, whether they'd be going home soon. One child, a 4-year-old, who shouldn't have had the vocabulary for it, told me that Marcus had said she was going to be okay even if it didn't feel like it for a while. She was going through a particularly brutal round of chemo at the time. She is, as far as I know, in full remission today. But I hadn't seen him myself. Not yet. That changed in December. We had a patient named Amara. She was 7 years old,
and she had been on our unit for almost 3 months when I met her. She was being treated for a particularly aggressive form of cancer, and her prognosis was, I will be honest with you, because she deserves honesty, not good. Her family knew this. The medical team knew this. Amara herself, in that particular way that very sick children sometimes have, of understanding things that adults haven't explicitly told them, seemed to know this too. She was extraordinary. That word gets used a lot about sick children, and I want to be careful with it, because it can become a way of making tragedy more palatable. But Amara was genuinely extraordinary. Curious, perceptive, possessed of a bone-dry 7-year-old sense of humor that could reduce an entire nursing staff to helpless laughter. She liked astronomy. She could name every planet and most of the major moons, and she had opinions, capital O, about whether Pluto deserved to be a planet. She was firmly pro-Pluto. She would not be moved on this. She mentioned Marcus early in her stay, in the same casual way that Lily had mentioned him, like mentioning a friend from school, someone everyone obviously knew. Marcus told me about you, she informed me one morning, while I was checking her IV. Oh yeah? I kept my voice light. What did he say? He said you were going to be my favorite nurse. She considered this. He was right. Don't tell the other nurses. Your secret's safe with me, I said. Over the following weeks, Amara talked about Marcus fairly regularly. He was, according to her, a reliable nighttime presence, showing up when she couldn't sleep, talking to her about things, sometimes just sitting with her. She described him exactly as the other children had. Red cap, calm demeanor, knowing things. She told me once very quietly that Marcus had told her she shouldn't be scared. About the treatments, I asked. About after, she said simply. I didn't ask her to elaborate. Some conversations you don't push. In mid-December, Amara took a turn for the worse. The kind of turn that the medical team had been bracing for, that her family had been dreading. She was transitioned to comfort care, which meant our job shifted from treating her illness to keeping her comfortable, keeping her pain managed, making sure her remaining time was as peaceful as possible. I was with her the night of December 19th. It was quiet on the unit, that deep, still quiet of a winter night, the kind that settles into hospital corridors and makes the whole world feel like it's holding its breath. Amara was sleeping, her mother dozing in the recliner by the bed, the monitor soft and steady. I was doing charting at the small desk in the corner of the room. We sometimes did that with the most critical patients, stayed close, kept an eye on things without making the family feel watched. I had been there for about 2 hours.
At approximately 2:45 a.m., Amara woke up, not in distress, not in pain. I checked immediately, moved to her bedside, assessed her. She was awake and calm, her eyes open and clear and focused on something on the other side of the room. I followed her gaze. I don't know how to explain what I saw in a way that will make sense to someone who hasn't experienced something like this. I am a trained medical professional. I deal in evidence and data and peer-reviewed research. I am not given to flights of imagination or wishful thinking. And I am telling you that I saw, in the corner of that room, near the window, something that I cannot explain. It was a shape. I hesitate to say a figure because it wasn't solid. It was more like the suggestion of a figure, the way a shape can materialize from static if you look at it long enough, but in reverse, present enough to register. Present enough that the part of my brain responsible for recognizing human forms identified it as a child, standing quietly, wearing what appeared to be a baseball cap. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it was gone, and the corner was just a corner, and the only light was the faint glow of the monitor screen. Amara looked at me. Her expression was utterly peaceful. "He's here," she said softly. Her mother stirred in the recliner. Amara reached out and took my hand, which she hadn't done before. She was not a handholder or Amara. She was too independent for that. And she held it for a moment. "He says it's really nice," she said. "Where he is, he says there are no tubes." She closed her eyes. Amara passed away 4 days later, on December 23rd, just before dawn, with her family around her. It was peaceful in the way that those deaths can be. Painful and devastating and peaceful all at once, which is one of the most profound contradictions I have ever lived inside. I was not on shift when she died. I found out when I came in for my next shift, and Janet told me, and I went into the break room and cried for about 10 minutes, which is approximately 9.5 minutes longer than I usually allow myself. Then I washed my face and went back to work, because that's what you do. I left Hargrove Children's Hospital about 4 months later, not because of Amara specifically, and not because of Marcus. Honestly, whatever Marcus Webb was or is, he brought comfort to children who needed it, and I cannot find it in myself to be frightened of that. I left because of the weight of it, the accumulated weight of 2 years on that unit, and because I needed to put some distance between myself and a place where I had learned things about the world that I wasn't entirely sure I was ready to know. I think about Amara a lot. I think about her telling me it was really nice where Marcus was. I think about a 10-year-old boy in a red baseball cap who spent 12 years checking in on sick children in the dark, keeping them company, telling them not to be scared. And you know what? For a ghost story, it's not the worst thing I have ever heard. It's maybe even a little beautiful. But I'll tell you one thing. I still can't see a red baseball cap without stopping for just a second, without wondering, without hoping that wherever Amara is now, she's got a clear view of all the stars.